Have you ever experienced a moment in your life where everyone seemed to disappear? Friends who once called daily suddenly go silent. Relationships that felt permanent crumble overnight. Invitations dry up. Your phone stops ringing. And you're left standing alone, wondering what you did wrong. If you felt this profound isolation, I want you to understand something crucial. This isn't punishment. It isn't abandonment. And it certainly isn't the universe forsaking you. According to Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychological minds in history, this isolation serves a far deeper purpose, one that most people never understand until they've emerged on the other side. Today, we're going to explore why the universe sometimes clears everyone from your path, what Jung believed about these periods of solitude, and how this process might be the most important transformation you'll ever experience. By the end of this video, you'll see your loneliness not as a curse, but as a sacred invitation. Carl Jung called these periods of profound isolation the dark night of the soul, a concept he borrowed from the Christian mystic St. John of the Cross, but expanded through his psychological lens. Jung understood that certain phases of life demand complete solitude, not because we're broken, but because we're being rebuilt. Think of it this way. When a caterpillar enters the chrysalis, it doesn't just grow wings. The caterpillar literally dissolves. Its entire body breaks down into a cellular soup before reorganizing into something entirely new. If you were to cut open that chrysalis midway through, you wouldn't find a caterpillar with half-formed wings. You'd find primordial goo. This is what's happening to you during these periods of isolation. You're not being destroyed. You're being dissolved so you can be reconstructed at a higher level of consciousness. Jung wrote extensively about individuation, the process by which a person integrates the conscious and unconscious parts of their psyche to become whole. This isn't a gentle, comfortable process. It's messy, painful, and necessarily lonely. Why? Because individuation requires you to face parts of yourself that you've hidden from the world, and even from yourself. When everyone leaves your life, you lose your mirrors. You lose the external validation that told you who you were. You lose the roles you played, the good friend, the reliable partner, the life of the party, and you're forced to discover who you actually are beneath those masks. Jung called these masks the persona, and while they're necessary for navigating society, they're not who you truly are. The persona is the face you show the world, the acceptable version of yourself that keeps social bonds intact. But the real you, what Jung called the self, exists deeper, beyond reputation and social acceptance. The universe removes people from your life when you've become too identified with your persona, when you've lost touch with your authentic self in the pursuit of pleasing others, fitting in, or maintaining relationships that no longer serve your soul's evolution. One of Jung's most profound contributions to psychology was his concept of the shadow. All the parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or hidden away because they're deemed unacceptable by society, our families, or ourselves. The shadow contains our rage, our desires, our shame, our power, everything we've been taught to suppress. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot integrate your shadow while surrounded by people. The presence of others activates your social conditioning, your need for approval, your impulse to wear the mask. As long as people are watching, you'll unconsciously perform rather than transform. When the universe clears everyone from your path, it's creating the only environment where true shadow work is possible. In solitude, there's no one to impress, no one to maintain appearances for, no one whose judgment you fear. It's just you and the disowned parts of yourself, finally meeting face to face. Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. During periods of isolation, the unconscious material you've been avoiding comes flooding to the surface. Old wounds reopen, patterns become visible. The ways you've betrayed yourself for acceptance, become painfully clear. This is why isolation often feels like a crisis. You're not just alone. You're confronting everything you've been running from. The friends who disappeared weren't just leaving. They were mirrors reflecting back a version of you that no longer fits who you're becoming. Their departure creates space for the confrontation you've been avoiding. Consider what happens in your alone time. Do thoughts you've never voiced suddenly demand attention? Do old memories resurface with new meaning? Do you feel anger, grief, or desires that society taught you to hide? This isn't random. This is your shadow emerging from the darkness, demanding integration. Jung warned that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The isolation you're experiencing is the universe's intervention, forcing you to embody what you've kept hidden. This process is uncomfortable, but it's the only path to wholeness. The shadow doesn't just contain negative qualities. It also holds your disowned power, your unexpressed creativity, your suppressed authenticity. Many people hide their brilliance to avoid threatening others or standing out. They dim their light to maintain relationships. When those relationships dissolve, that hidden brilliance can finally emerge. Jung understood that psychological transformation mirrors the death and rebirth cycles found throughout nature and mythology. He studied alchemy extensively, not as literal chemistry, but as a symbolic representation of psychological transformation. The alchemists spoke of the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the necessary death that precedes rebirth. When everyone leaves your life, you're in the nigredo. The old you is dying, and death is never comfortable, even when it's metaphorical. The relationships that defined you are gone. The identity you constructed is crumbling. The future you imagined has dissolved. You're in the void between who you were and who you're becoming. Most people panic during this phase. They desperately try to rebuild what's been destroyed, to reconnect with people who've left, to return to the familiar comfort of their old life. But Jung would say this resistance only prolongs the suffering. The death must be allowed to complete itself before rebirth is possible. Think about the people who've left your life during this period. Were they actually aligned with your authentic path, or were they connected to an outdated version of you? Were those friendships built on your true self or on the persona you were performing? Often, we discover that the relationships we're mourning were based on who we pretended to be, not who we actually are. The universe isn't cruel, it's efficient. It removes what no longer serves your evolution, even when that removal is painful. Those people couldn't walk with you into the next phase of your life because they were tied to the old you, the one who's dying. Their departure isn't rejection, it's completion. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires the death of who you falsely believed yourself to be. Every outgrown identity must be mourned and released. Every mask must be shattered. Every comfortable lie must be exposed. This is why the isolation feels so absolute. You're not just losing people. You're losing your entire orientation to reality. The frameworks you use to understand yourself and the world are collapsing. The beliefs you inherited are being tested. The goals you adopted from others are being questioned. Everything is up for examination. During this death phase, many people experience what feels like a spiritual crisis. Questions arise that have no easy answers. Who am I really? What do I actually want? What do I believe when I strip away everything I was taught? These questions are terrifying because they have no external answers. You must discover the truth within yourself, in the silence, in the solitude. After the death comes something unexpected, not an immediate rebirth into clarity and purpose, but rather a slow emergence, like the first green shoots pushing through scorched earth. Jung called this phase the transcendent function, where opposites within the psyche begin to reconcile and a new center of gravity forms. This is when you start to notice something remarkable. You're different. The opinions of others don't control you the way they once did. You're less reactive, less desperate for approval, less willing to betray yourself for acceptance. There's a quiet strength that wasn't there before, born from having survived the dissolution and confronted the shadow. The authentic self, in Jung's framework, isn't something you create. It's something you uncover. It was always there, buried beneath layers of conditioning, trauma, social expectations, and protective personas. The isolation stripped away those layers, often brutally, leaving you exposed to your own essence. People who emerge from periods of profound isolation often report feeling like they've met themselves for the first time. They discover preferences they didn't know they had, values that aren't borrowed from others, and a sense of direction that comes from within rather than from external validation. This is the gold the alchemist spoke of, the treasure hidden in the darkness. But here's what Jung emphasized. This new authenticity often makes you incomprehensible to people who knew the old you. Your family might not recognize this version of you. Old friends might feel uncomfortable around your new energy. Society might resist the truth you're now willing to speak. This is why the isolation often continues even after you've begun to transform. The authentic self doesn't fit neatly into pre-existing boxes. It challenges conformity by its very existence. Jung himself experienced this throughout his life. His ideas were too radical for many of his peers, including his mentor Freud. His commitment to his own truth cost him relationships and professional standing, but it gave birth to a body of work that continues to transform lives decades after his death. When you're living from your authentic self, you naturally attract different people and opportunities, but there's often a gap period, a time when the old has fully departed but the new hasn't yet arrived. This gap requires faith. You must trust that by honoring your truth, you're aligning with a life that's meant for you, even if you can't yet see what that life looks like. Jung believed that the psyche has an inherent drive toward wholeness, what he called the individuation process. The universe isn't removing people from your life randomly. It's orchestrating the conditions necessary for your individuation. Every departure, every ending, every moment of solitude is calibrated to strip away what's false and reveal what's true. Jung was deeply interested in the spiritual dimensions of psychological transformation. He recognized that across cultures and throughout history, spiritual awakening has always required periods of solitude. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree alone. Muhammad retreated to the cave. Moses climbed the mountain by himself. These weren't coincidences. They represent a fundamental truth about transformation. It requires separation from the collective to hear the voice of the divine, however you understand that term. In Jung's language, it requires separation from the collective unconscious to access the self, which he saw as having numinous, spiritual qualities. The collective unconscious, according to Jung, is the shared layer of human experience, the myths, archetypes, and patterns that unite humanity. While this collective layer contains wisdom, it also contains the gravitational pull of conformity, the pressure to be like everyone else, to want what everyone wants, to fear what everyone fears. When the universe removes everyone from your life, it's temporarily releasing you from this collective gravity. You're being given the rare opportunity to float free, to discover what you think and feel and believe when you're not unconsciously absorbing the attitudes and expectations of those around you. This is profoundly disorienting at first. Humans are social creatures, and we derive much of our sense of reality from consensus. When that consensus is removed, reality itself becomes fluid. What you thought was solid truth reveals itself as collective agreement. What you thought was your own opinion reveals itself as inherited belief. In this disorientation lies enormous opportunity. You can reconstruct your relationship with reality based on direct experience rather than borrowed concepts. You can form beliefs that arise from your own inquiry rather than social conditioning. You can discover a spirituality that's authentically yours rather than something you've adopted to belong. Jung spoke of numinous experiences, moments when the sacred breaks through into ordinary consciousness, leaving you changed. These experiences rarely happen when you're distracted by social obligations and the constant noise of other people's needs and opinions. They require silence, stillness, and solitude. The universe creates this silence by removing the noise. Every person who leaves creates more space for the still, small voice within, the voice of intuition, of the self, of whatever you understand as the divine. This voice has been trying to reach you for years, but you couldn't hear it over the clamor of maintaining relationships that had become obstacles to your evolution. Jung emphasized that individuation isn't about becoming isolated forever. It's about becoming whole so you can return to community as your authentic self. The isolation is a temporary necessary phase, not a permanent destination. The hero's journey, which Jung helped illuminate, always includes a return. But you don't return as the same person who left. You return transformed, carrying hard-won wisdom, integrated shadows, and a connection to your authentic self that can't be shaken by others' opinions or expectations. You return as someone who knows who they are. Here's what's fascinating. When you emerge from this period of isolation as your authentic self, you begin attracting people who resonate with the real you. These new connections feel different from the old ones. They're based on truth rather than performance, on acceptance rather than approval-seeking, on mutual evolution rather than comfortable stagnation. The relationships you build after this transformation tend to be fewer, but deeper. Jung himself maintained relatively few close relationships, but spoke of their profound importance. Quality over quantity becomes your natural orientation because you've learned that authentic connection with one person outweighs superficial connection with dozens. You also develop a different relationship with solitude itself. Instead of fearing it, you befriend it. You recognize that regular periods of solitude aren't isolation, but necessary maintenance, time to reconnect with yourself, to integrate new experiences, to listen to the inner voice that guides your individuation. This shift is crucial. Before the transformation, you avoided solitude because it felt like abandonment. After the transformation, you seek solitude because it feels like homecoming. You've discovered that you're never truly alone when you're connected to yourself. The integration phase also involves learning to hold the tension of opposites, another key Jungian concept. You learn to be both connected and autonomous, both part of community and a unique individual, both accepting of others and uncompromising in your truth. These aren't contradictions, but complementary aspects of wholeness. Many people who've been through this process describe feeling like they're finally living in color after years of living in black and white. The world appears more vivid, more meaningful, more alive. This isn't because the world changed. It's because you're now perceiving it through awakened consciousness rather than through the fog of unconscious patterns and borrowed beliefs. Jung called this awakened state consciousness, not just being awake, but being aware of being aware, knowing yourself, seeing the patterns that once controlled you, living deliberately rather than reactively. This consciousness is the treasure the isolation was protecting, the pearl of great price that required everything else to be surrendered. So, what do you actually do when you find yourself in this period of isolation? Jung offers several practical insights. First, honor the process. Don't fight the isolation or frantically try to fill the void with new people or distractions. The void exists for a reason. It's sacred space, not empty space. Treat it with respect. Use it intentionally for self-inquiry, shadow work, and integration. Second, engage with your unconscious. Jung was a strong advocate of active imagination, dream work, and creative expression as ways to dialogue with the unconscious mind. When you're isolated, you have unprecedented access to your inner world. Write, paint, dance, explore your dreams. Let the unconscious speak through symbols and images. Third, study the wisdom traditions. Jung himself drew from alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern philosophy, and world mythology. These traditions contain maps for the journey you're on. You're not the first person to walk through the dark night of the soul, and the wisdom of those who've traveled this path before you is available. Fourth, develop a relationship with your shadow. Rather than seeing your rejected parts as enemies, begin to understand them as exiled aspects of yourself that hold energy, power, and gifts. The anger you've suppressed might contain necessary boundaries. The selfishness you've denied might contain healthy self-care. Integration means welcoming these exiled parts home. Fifth, find meaning in the suffering. Jung emphasized that suffering without meaning is unbearable, but suffering with meaning can be transformative. Frame this period not as punishment but as initiation, not as abandonment but as preparation, not as ending but as metamorphosis. Sixth, trust the timing. The universe operates on rhythms that don't align with your ego's timeline. You might want instant transformation, but real psychological and spiritual evolution takes time. The isolation will end when its purpose has been fulfilled, not a moment sooner or later. Seventh, maintain basic rituals and routines. Even in the midst of dissolution, structure helps. Simple daily practices, morning pages, walks in nature, meditation, healthy meals, provide anchors when everything else feels unstable. These rituals honor your body and create continuity while your psyche undergoes reconstruction. Carl Jung understood something that most people never grasp. Sometimes the universe's greatest gift looks like its cruelest punishment. The isolation you're experiencing isn't evidence that you're unlovable or that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that something is profoundly right, that you're being called to a deeper level of authenticity, consciousness, and wholeness than the life you were living could accommodate. The people had to leave. The old life had to end. The comfortable certainties had to crumble, not because the universe is cruel, but because you were ready for something more real, even if you didn't consciously know it. Your soul knew, and your soul orchestrated the conditions necessary for your transformation. If you're in this place right now alone, confused, wondering why everyone disappeared, I want you to hear this. You're not being punished. You're being prepared. You're not being abandoned. You're being transformed. You're not ending. You're becoming. The caterpillar doesn't know it's going to become a butterfly. It only knows dissolution, darkness, and the terrifying loss of everything familiar. But the butterfly emerges nonetheless, not despite the darkness, but because of it. Trust the process. Honor the isolation. Do the inner work. Your emergence is already underway, and when you finally spread your wings, you'll understand why the universe had to remove everyone from your life. You couldn't become who you truly are while surrounded by people who only knew who you used to be. The universe didn't remove people from your life. It removed obstacles from your path, and that path leads home, to yourself. Thank you for watching.